Picture a world where borders shift not by the clash of swords, but by the quiet footsteps of pilgrims. Across the rugged landscapes of medieval Europe, these travelers moved in endless streams, not just carrying prayers and relics, but something far more powerful: maps. Not the kind of maps you might expect, drawn by kings or generals to mark conquests. These were living documents, sketched by hand, passed between travelers, and whispered about in market squares and monastery halls. They didn't just guide journeys, they quietly redrew the very shape of the continent. Here's the astonishing truth: while history books often focus on wars and treaties to explain how Europe's borders evolved, some of the most profound changes came without a single battle. Pilgrimage routes became invisible lines of influence, stitching together distant regions through faith, trade, and the unassuming power of shared knowledge. A monk in Spain might trace a route to Rome, and suddenly, towns along that path flourished. A merchant's handwritten sketch of a mountain pass could turn a forgotten valley into a hub of commerce. These maps didn't just reflect geography, they created it. So how did these fragile, often overlooked scraps of parchment become tools of silent revolution? How did pilgrims, ordinary people with no armies or titles, reshape the political and cultural fabric of an entire era? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. This is a story of hidden connections, of borders drawn in ink and trust rather than blood and iron. By the end of this journey, you'll never look at a medieval map or the idea of power the same way again. The past is waiting to surprise you. Let's begin. Among the winding paths of medieval Europe, few were as transformative as the great pilgrimage routes, roads like the Camino de Santiago or the Via Francigena. What began as simple footpaths for the faithful soon became something far greater: lifelines of culture, commerce, and connection. Think of them not just as roads, but as living, breathing networks where ideas flowed as freely as the travelers who walked them. Monasteries that once stood in quiet isolation suddenly found themselves at the crossroads of the world, their doors open to pilgrims from every corner of the continent. These holy sites didn't just offer shelter, they became powerhouses of influence. Take the Abbey of Cluny along the Via Francigena, a place so wealthy and well-connected it rivaled kings. Or the city of Santiago de Compostela, where the mere presence of St. James relics turned a remote corner of Spain into a bustling epicenter of devotion and trade. Pilgrims didn't just come to pray, they brought goods, languages, and stories from lands hundreds of miles apart. And with them came their maps, sometimes scribbled on scraps of parchment, sometimes memorized and passed along by word of mouth. But here's what's fascinating: these routes didn't just change the places they touched, they reshaped how people saw the world. A merchant from Flanders and a farmer from Italy might never have met, until they found themselves side by side on the road to Rome, swapping tales under the same stars. Over time, these encounters wove a shared tapestry of European identity, one where borders mattered less than the bonds forged by faith and footsteps. The relics pilgrims sought weren't just sacred objects, they were magnets pulling people across borders, blurring the lines between kingdoms and cultures. And at the heart of it all were the maps, not as tools of conquest, but as silent witnesses to a continent slowly stitching itself together. A pilgrim's sketch of a mountain pass could turn a forgotten trail into a highway of exchange. A monk's notes on safe stopping points might determine which towns thrived and which faded into obscurity. This was power, but not the kind wielded by armies. It was the quiet, steady force of movement, connection, and the irresistible pull of a shared journey. These pilgrim maps held secrets far beyond simple directions. They were medieval Europe's hidden diplomatic channels, carrying messages no king's envoy would dare whisper aloud. At first glance, they appeared devout. Jerusalem drawn at the center, saints' shrines marked with golden ink, rivers winding like sacred script across parchment. But look closer and another story emerges. Cartographers, often monks with loyalties stretching beyond their cloisters, wove political claims into the very fabric of these illustrations. A monastery's lands might appear exaggerated, its borders subtly expanded. A rival lord's territory could shrink to a mere sliver, dismissed with a careless stroke of the quill. Even trade routes, those lifeblood connections between cities, were sometimes redrawn to favor certain alliances over others. Take the Hereford Mappa Mundi, that sprawling masterpiece of medieval cartography. On the surface, it's a spiritual guide placing Jerusalem as the heart of the world, a reflection of church doctrine. Yet that same symbolism carried a razor-sharp political edge. By centering Christian holy sites while marginalizing rival kingdoms or pagan lands, the map quietly reinforced the church's authority over territories hotly contested by emperors and nobles. A pilgrim holding this map wouldn't just see a path to salvation. They'd absorb a visual argument about who truly ruled the world. But the real genius lay in how these maps bypassed traditional power structures altogether. While kings issued decrees that could ignite wars, and popes delivered bulls that demanded obedience, pilgrim maps worked in whispers. A merchant traveling from Venice might carry a map favoring Genoa's trade routes, not by accident, but because the abbey that produced it had ties to Genoa's ruling council. A bishop's scribe could sketch a disputed mountain pass as belonging to his patron's diocese, planting that claim in the minds of countless travelers who'd later swear the land had always been under that bishop's care. Unlike treaties which required seals and signatures, these cartographic suggestions spread organically, shifting perceptions one pilgrim at a time. Perhaps most remarkably, this silent diplomacy thrived precisely because it hid in plain sight. To secular authorities, these were just religious artifacts unworthy of scrutiny. But to the monasteries and city-states that crafted them, they were instruments of soft power, subtle, deniable, and astonishingly effective. By the time a prince noticed his borders seemed to shrink on every map in circulation, it was too late. The story had already been written, not on parchment, but in the collective memory of an entire continent. Deep in the candlelit scriptoriums of medieval Europe, a quiet revolution was taking place, one stroke of a quill at a time. The monks bent over their parchment weren't just copying sacred texts, they were redrawing the very fabric of the continent, armed with nothing more than ink and a unique kind of immunity. Unlike kings or lords, these monastic cartographers moved through the world with a rare neutrality, their robes offering protection from the political storms raging outside monastery walls. A bishop might demand allegiance, a baron might threaten war, but a monk sketching borders in the name of pilgrimage. His work flew under the radar, even as it subtly reshaped the world. Take the Abbey of St. Gall, perched in what's now Switzerland. To the untrained eye, its maps were pious tools, dotted with churches and marked with Latin prayers. But between the lines, something far more strategic was unfolding. A river might shift course on parchment, nudging a disputed valley into the abbey's sphere of influence. A border once claimed by a local lord could quietly vanish, replaced by the faint outline of a pilgrim's path implying the land belonged to the church. These weren't mistakes, they were deliberate acts of cartographic diplomacy disguised as acts of devotion. The genius of these revisions lay in their plausibility. Who would challenge a map made for pilgrims? To question it was to risk appearing unchristian. a dangerous accusation in an age where faith and power were entwined. And so these adjustments seeped into the mainstream, copied by travelers, cited by merchants, and eventually accepted as fact. A monk in St. Gall could alter a border in the morning, and by year's end, that same line might appear in maps from Paris to Prague, carried in the satchels of unsuspecting pilgrims. But the monks' influence went beyond borders. Their maps became living archives of knowledge, preserving not just geography but the fragile threads of cultural memory. When a scribe in Rheims added a note about a ruined Roman bridge along the pilgrimage route, he wasn't just offering directions. He was ensuring that bridge wouldn't be forgotten, that the road it served would remain alive in the minds of travelers. In an era before printing presses, these handwritten maps were the closest thing Europe had to a shared database, updated one monastery at a time. By the time secular rulers realized what was happening, it was too late. The lines had been redrawn not by armies but by the steady hands of monks who understood something profound, that a map isn't just a reflection of the world, it's a blueprint for the world to come. And in their scriptoriums, far from the clamor of battlefields, they were drafting a new Europe, one pilgrimage at a time. What looked like a pilgrim's devotion was often a merchant's blueprint for wealth. Beneath the crosses and saints' shrines marked on medieval maps lay another layer, carefully plotted trade routes, disguised as sacred paths. Pilgrims moved in droves, and where they walked, money followed. Towns along the Via Francigena didn't just offer rest for weary souls. They buzzed with markets catering to travelers hungry for food, souvenirs, and safe passage. A map might point to a saint's relic, but it also led to a thriving wool market or a blacksmith's forge. The roads to Rome, Jerusalem, or Santiago weren't just spiritual highways. They were the medieval equivalent of modern shipping lanes, pulsing with economic potential. Venice, that cunning queen of the Adriatic, mastered this game early. The city's cartographers didn't just update maps, they subtly rerouted them. A path to a minor shrine might suddenly appear more prominent on Venetian-sponsored charts, conveniently guiding pilgrims, and their coin toward lagoon-side inns and Venetian-controlled ports. Even the Piacenza pilgrim, that anonymous 6th-century traveler, couldn't resist mixing commerce with devotion. His diary didn't just describe holy sites, it meticulously noted where to find the best prices for Syrian silk or Egyptian spices. What reads like a spiritual guidebook was also a merchant's handbook, proof that faith and finance were two sides of the same coin. But the real power of these trade disguised as pilgrimage routes lay in their neutrality. While kings taxed merchants at formal borders, pilgrim paths operated in a curious legal gray area. Church protection meant safer travel, and savvy traders exploited this. A Florentine wool merchant might join a group heading to Santiago, his pack mules laden with goods under the guise of pilgrimage supplies. By the time local lords realized their tariffs were being bypassed, the economic landscape had already shifted. Towns like Vézelay in France or Conques in the Pyrenees, once quiet stops for prayer, became bustling hubs where Flemish cloth met Italian glassware, no battle required. The maps themselves told this dual story. Rivers weren't just geographical features, they were marked with notes about toll-free bridges controlled by friendly abbeys. Mountain passes bore symbols not just for safety, but for which lords could be bribed to look the other way. Even the handwriting gave clues. Notes in margins about generous hospitality often meant a town's merchants paid monks to steer travelers their way. These weren't just maps, they were medieval TripAdvisor reviews with economic consequences. This quiet collusion of faith and trade reshaped Europe's economic borders more decisively than any treaty. When a pilgrim route stabilized, so did the flow of goods along it. Regions once isolated found themselves suddenly connected to far-off markets. their local economies pivoting to serve the endless stream of travelers. The Camino de Santiago didn't just create a path to a cathedral. It forged a corridor where Galician silver met North African leather, where Breton linen changed hands under the watchful eyes of saints. And all of it happened without a single army marching, just the relentless footsteps of pilgrims, the scratch of monks' pens, and the unassuming power of maps that everyone trusted, but few truly understood. In the northwest corner of Spain, where mist clings to rolling green hills, a legend quietly rewrote the map of an entire kingdom. Santiago de Compostela started as little more than a rumor, a whisper that the bones of St. James had washed ashore in a field of stars. But by the 12th century, it had become a magnet pulling hundreds of thousands of pilgrims across Europe, their footsteps carving new political realities into the earth. Local rulers along the Camino didn't just tolerate this flood of travelers, they weaponized it. Roads were paved, bridges built, and hospitals founded not out of pure charity, but because every pilgrim who stopped to rest was a living boundary marker, their presence reinforcing who controlled the land. The Codex Callixtinus, that lavish 12th century guidebook for Compostela pilgrims, reads like a medieval trip advisor with a hidden agenda. Its pages don't just describe sacred sites, they meticulously chart a path funneling travelers through Leon and Navarre kingdoms locked in bitter rivalry. Why direct pilgrims through Burgos instead of a shorter mountain pass? Because Leon's rulers funded the manuscript's creation, ensuring their territory became the Camino's spine. Towns like Sahagun and Leon didn't just appear on the route, they were strategically placed there, their markets and monasteries swelling with the economic and spiritual currency of endless foot traffic. Even the Codex's warnings about bandits served a purpose, steering pilgrims toward protected routes that just happened to reinforce Leon's territorial claims. What's startling is how this spiritual migration upended traditional power dynamics. While the Reconquista's battles dominate history books, knights clashing over fortresses, kings drawing lines in blood, the Camino achieved similar results through quiet persistence. A Navarrese lord might win a skirmish, but Leon's control of the pilgrimage route meant its culture, laws, and even language seeped into the land. Pilgrims didn't conquer territory, they normalized it. A merchant from Flanders settling in Leon to sell scallop shell badges wasn't a soldier, yet his presence made the kingdom's borders more tangible than any battlefield victory. The genius of the Compostela phenomenon lay in its deniability. No one could accuse a monk of drawing a map with conquest in mind. It was just a humble guide for the faithful. But when that map directed pilgrims to cross a river at a specific ford, bypassing a rival lord's toll bridge, the economic consequences were undeniable. Even the iconic scallop shell, the symbol of St. James, became a territorial marker. Found on artifacts from the Pyrenees to Galicia, these shells didn't just signify devotion. They were physical proof of how far Compostela's influence reached, a quiet rebuke to anyone who doubted the region's cohesion. By the time the Reconquista's armies reached the Atlantic, the real work had already been done. The Camino had woven Leon and Galicia into a single cultural fabric, their shared identity cemented not by force, but by the countless pilgrims who'd walked the path, slept in its inns, and carried its stories home. Santiago's rise proves a radical truth. Sometimes the most powerful borders aren't drawn with swords, but with footprints. When Pope Innocent III placed his seal on a pilgrim's map in the year 1215, he wasn't just blessing parchment, he was bending borders. The Via Francigena, that ancient road from Canterbury to Rome, became the testing ground for a brilliant strategy, using cartography as a tool of soft conquest. Official church maps of the route didn't merely guide travelers, they etched papal authority into the landscape itself. dangerous stretches suddenly appeared smoother when they crossed church lands. Hostile lords' territories were marked with ominous warnings, while abbeys loyal to Rome gleamed like beacons of safety. What looked like spiritual guidance was, in truth, a masterclass in territorial influence. The genius lay in the Church's dual role. As Europe's spiritual compass, it could declare which routes were sacred and which were perilous, a power no king could challenge without risking his soul. When Innocent's cartographers labeled the Alpine passes near Siena as treacherous unless guided by local monks, they weren't lying. But those monks just happened to answer to the Pope, not the Holy Roman Emperor who nominally ruled the region. Pilgrims, desperate for safe passage, funneled into papal-controlled zones, their footsteps transforming theory into reality. Soon, taverns, toll stations, and even laws sprouted along these church-endorsed paths, turning maps into self-fulfilling prophecies of control. Lay rulers weren't blind to this game, they simply learned to play it better. Take Frederick II, that brilliant but excommunicated Holy Roman Emperor. Denied the Church's map-making machinery, he created his own. Imperial agents quietly distributed alternative pilgrim guides that emphasized routes through his southern Italian domains, complete with fawning descriptions of his newly built hostels. In Champagne, Count Theobald IV went further, commissioning maps that exaggerated the comforts of his towns along the Via Francigena. His scribes even forgot to mark rival bishops' territories, leaving blank spaces where inconvenient jurisdictions lay. This cartographic chess game reached its peak with the rise of the Mappa Mundi, those grand, circular world maps that framed Jerusalem as the center of creation. Popes understood their psychological power. A pilgrim seeing Rome depicted as the spiritual heart of Europe would carry that mental image home, but secular rulers fought back with maps of their own. The famous Ebstorf map, likely sponsored by German nobility, subtly shifted emphasis to Charlemagne's legacy, a not-so-subtle reminder that emperors, not just popes, could claim divine sanction. The irony, this battle over lines and legends often left pilgrims themselves as unwitting pawns. A merchant from Bruges might choose his route based on which map promised safer roads, never realizing he was walking a path carefully curated to enrich one power over another. Yet in their collective movement, there are thousands of choices to follow this river or that mountain pass. These ordinary travelers became the quiet architects of Europe's political landscape. The maps may have claimed to serve the faithful, but in truth, they revealed a deeper medieval truth, that belief and power were always two sides of the same coin. Henry II of England knew the power of a humble pilgrim's cloak. When he walked barefoot to Canterbury in 1174, grieving Thomas Becket's murder, every step was a masterclass in political theater. Here was Europe's most powerful monarch playing the penitent, yet the message to his rivals was anything but meek. By publicly embracing the pilgrimage trails crisscrossing his Angevin lands, Henry didn't just atone for a saint's death, he staked a spiritual claim over territories from Normandy to Aquitaine. The roads he traveled weren't just paths to redemption, they were living proof of his dominion, etched into the earth by the feet of his subjects, and now his own royal souls. Richard the Lionheart took this game further. His pilgrimage to Vézelay in 1190 wasn't merely devotion, it was a diplomatic coup wrapped in sacred ritual. Meeting Philip Augustus of France at the Burgundian shrine, Richard leveraged the site's neutrality to negotiate a truce that would shape the Third Crusade. The unspoken brilliance, Vézelay lay along the Via Lamovicensis, a major Compostela route controlled by Richard's allies. By choosing this stage, he ensured the maps recording their meetings subtly reinforced Plantagenet influence. Chroniclers noted how Richard arrived with a train of English bishops and Aquitanian nobles, their presence turning the abbey into a temporary Angevin court. Pilgrimage here wasn't an escape from politics, it was politics by other means. Even the act of royal map-making became performative. When Alfonso VI of Leon commissioned a new pilgrim guide in the 11th century, he didn't just list routes, he embedded his lineage alongside St. James' miracles, binding his kingship to the sacred geography. These maps circulated not in royal chambers but in pilgrims' satchels, spreading propaganda disguised as piety. A traveler from Cologne might never see Alfonso's face, but after studying a map where Leon's cities glowed with golden halos, they'd carry that association home. What made these royal pilgrimages so effective was their layered symbolism. A king walking the roads like any commoner demonstrated sacred humility, but the entourage of scribes recording his journey, the alms distributed at strategic stops, and the carefully chosen routes through disputed lands told another story. These weren't retreats from power, they were conquests in soft leather sandals. When Henry II's chroniclers described him washing pilgrims' feet at Rocamadour, they weren't just documenting charity, they were broadcasting his authority over a key Compostela alternate route, a subtle rebuttal to French territorial claims. The maps that survived these journeys hold silent testimony to their cunning. Richard's Vézelay detour appears as a pious footnote in some, but Aquitanian copies exaggerate its prominence, as if the meeting were destined by divine cartography. Alfonso's Leon isn't just marked, it's illustrated with towers taller than neighboring kingdoms, a visual echo of his title, Emperor of all Spain. Even the stains on these parchments whisper secrets. Wine spills near Angevin-held ports suggest maps were consulted during treaty negotiations, their routes serving as bargaining chips. In the end, these monarchs understood what warlords often forgot, that a border drawn in the minds of pilgrims could prove more enduring than one won by the sword. Their journeys reshaped maps not through conquest but through the slow, steady work of association, linking dynasties to divine favor, territories to tradition, and their own names to the roads that bound Europe together. When we trace their routes today, we're not just following paths of faith, we're walking the hidden blueprints of medieval power. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just walk pilgrim roads, she rewrote them. When this Queen Duchess set out for Jerusalem in 1147, her journey was anything but ordinary. Traveling with an entourage that included her ladies-in-waiting, scribes, and even a portable scriptorium, Eleanor transformed pilgrimage into political theater. The maps her party carried weren't just navigational tools, they were living documents annotated with notes about which lords were kin through marriage, which abbeys owed loyalty to Aquitaine, and which mountain passes lay near disputed territories. Every stop became an opportunity not just for prayer, but for reinforcing the invisible web of alliances that held her vast domains together. What made noblewomen like Eleanor so effective was their unique position in medieval society. While men waged wars over borders, women pilgrims moved through those same spaces with surprising freedom, their journeys framed as pious acts rather than power plays. A queen might be barred from leading armies, but no one could deny her right to kneel at a saint's shrine. And in that sacred space, surrounded by her network of chaplains and diplomats, she could broker marriages, secure trade agreements, and subtly shift territorial perceptions, all under the guise of devotion. The famous Pilgrim's Guide to Rome, typically attributed to male clerics, contains startling exceptions. Marginal notes in delicate script tracing familial connections between Italian bishoprics and French noble houses, likely added by noblewomen's attendants as they traveled. These female pilgrims didn't just use maps, they reshaped them. Take Matilda of Tuscany, the 11th century countess whose pilgrimages to Rome doubled as military supply runs. Her entourage maps marked not just holy sites, but granaries, forge locations, and friendly castles where her forces could regroup. Even more fascinating are the rare surviving fragments of the Liber Sancti Gertrudis, a pilgrim's guide with sections likely composed by canonesses in Saxony. Their maps emphasize convents and women's hospices along the Rhine, creating an alternate network of female-controlled way stations invisible on traditional routes. The true genius of these noblewomen lay in how they weaponized hospitality. When Eleanor stayed at a monastery in Vézelay, her patronage transformed it into a Plantagenet-leaning hub. When German Abbess Hildegard of Bingen hosted pilgrims, her letters reveal she was quietly gathering intelligence about rival lords' lands through travelers' stories. These weren't just rest stops, they were intelligence nodes, where the chatter of pilgrims about road conditions or border disputes was recorded and repurposed. A duchess's scribe might adjust a map based on which countess offered the warmest welcome, knowing such social bonds carried more weight than parchment claims. Gender didn't just influence these journeys, it dictated how the maps themselves were read. Male pilgrims often focused on distances and dangers, but women's annotations reveal a different priority: safety. The oldest known copy of the Mirabilia Romi, a guide to Rome's wonders, includes a female pilgrim's warning about a particular bridge where women alone should not linger after Vespers. Other marginalia highlight convents with strong gates or towns where local widows would take in stranded travelers. This wasn't just practical advice, it created parallel routes, steering female pilgrims and their political influence towards specific protected networks. By the time Eleanor's granddaughter Blanche of Castile made her own pilgrimages, the game had evolved. Her entourage maps bore symbols modern historians now recognize as code. A tiny fleur-de-lis next to a bishop's seat might indicate his openness to French royal influence, while crossed keys could mark papal territories resistant to her son's claims. The roads these women walked became living borders, their very footsteps reinforcing dynastic narratives that parchment decrees could never achieve. In an era when women's political power was often indirect, pilgrimage offered something revolutionary: a way to redraw the map without ever picking up a sword. Marco Polo's uncle wasn't just a merchant or a pilgrim, he was a cartographic revolutionary in disguise. When Maffei Polo set out from Venice in 1260, his maps held two sets of annotations: gold leaf crosses marking holy sites for prayer, and tiny pepper icons noting where a savvy trader could turn piety into profit. This dual-purpose navigation didn't just guide his journey, it revealed a seismic shift in how medieval Europe understood borders. The Catalan Atlas, that stunning 14th-century masterpiece, captures this hybrid vision perfectly. Jerusalem gleams at its center, yet the same parchment traces camel caravans from Trebizond to Beijing. Sacred and commercial geographies weren't just overlapping now, they were inseparable. What made these merchant pilgrims so transformative was their ability to move between worlds. A Genoese trader kneeling at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre one day could be haggling over Armenian silver the next, all while updating maps with intelligence no king's spy could gather. Their charts became living documents where faith and finance merged. A coastal city's saintly relics might be drawn larger if its docks offered tax exemptions. The Ramusio map, commissioned by Venetian merchants, even coded safe harbors with halos, implying divine favor for ports that waived tariffs for pilgrims. This blending of motives quietly rewrote political realities. When the Polos negotiated with Kublai Khan, they weren't just securing trade deals. They were creating informal corridors of influence where Mongol and Christian territories blurred. A Khan's decree protecting pilgrims suddenly covered Venetian wool caravans too. Over time, these negotiated privileges hardened into facts. the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, once a buffer state, became a de facto Venetian protectorate simply because its rulers depended on pilgrim merchant traffic. The real stroke of genius, these maps weaponized trust. A bishop might doubt a merchant's ledger but wouldn't question a map bearing saints' shrines. The Catalan atlas's depiction of Mali's gold fields, sandwiched between drawings of Saint Christopher, gave European traders sacred cover for African expeditions. Even Mansa Musa's legendary pilgrimage to Mecca got repurposed. Italian maps emphasized his gold-dispersing stops, subtly rebranding West Africa as both a spiritual destination and a commercial El Dorado. By the 15th century, this fusion reached its peak in ports like Alexandria. There, Franciscan friars ran hostels that doubled as trading posts, their wall maps showing both the Via Dolorosa and current pepper prices. A pilgrim buying souvenirs might unknowingly fund the very routes that would later bypass Ottoman-controlled lands. The borders of empires weren't just changing, they were being redrawn in the ink of ledgers and the footsteps of those who worshipped with one hand and traded with the other. Among the most haunting legends of medieval Europe is the Children's Crusade, a tale of wide-eyed youth marching toward Jerusalem, only to vanish into tragedy. But here's the startling truth: the mass pilgrimage of children never happened. The myth, however, spread like wildfire, fueled not by facts but by something equally powerful: maps. Take the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1493, with its woodcut illustrations of innocent boys and girls clutching crosses. These images weren't just fanciful storytelling, they were strategic tools, reinforcing German claims to Mediterranean trade routes by painting their young crusaders as martyrs for Christendom. A fiction repeated on parchment became, over time, a political reality. The Chronicle's creators knew exactly what they were doing. By depicting children setting out from Cologne and Nuremberg, they tied these cities to sacred history, implying divine favor for their commercial ambitions. A closer look reveals the cunning details. The youths are shown following routes that just happen to bypass French-controlled territories, while German merchant hubs glow with celestial light. It didn't matter that the actual crusade likely involved a handful of teenage shepherds, not armies of children. The mapmaker's goal wasn't accuracy, it was association. Every time someone unfolded this lavish tome, they absorbed a subtle message. German lands produced pious heroes, and by extension, deserved influence over the pilgrim roads they'd supposedly sanctified with their sacrifice. What's fascinating is how these myths hardened into borders. When Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I cited the Chronicle to justify tariffs on Italian goods, he wasn't invoking laws or treaties, he was invoking a story. Merchants who'd never seen the original woodcuts nonetheless knew the tale, repeated in taverns and market squares until it became unassailable common knowledge. By the time rival powers challenged German dominance over Alpine passes, the legend had done its work. The roads were already stamped in Europe's imagination as belonging to the heirs of those mythical children. Then came the printing press, turning local fables into continental propaganda. Earlier pilgrim maps had circulated in dozens of handwritten copies. The Nuremberg Chronicle shipped hundreds of printed editions, each one a battering ram for territorial claims. Printers in Mainz and Strasbourg added their own flourishes, tweaking routes to favor their patrons. A French copy might show the children veering toward Marseille, subtly endorsing Provençal sovereignty. But the German originals always circled back to the Rhine, anchoring the myth where it served imperial interests. The legacy of these cartographic fantasies lingers in unexpected ways. Modern historians tracing the Children's Crusade's path find no physical evidence, no mass graves, no contemporary chronicles confirming the event. Yet the routes marked on those 15th century maps still shape modern tourism. Innsbruck's Crusaders' Way or the Pilgrim Steps of Graz owe their existence not to medieval footsteps, but to a printer's clever marketing, the ultimate irony. These invented journeys became so embedded in European consciousness that they influenced real pilgrimage patterns centuries later, as devout travelers unknowingly retraced paths that had only ever existed on paper. In the end, the Children's Crusade reveals a profound truth about medieval power. A well-placed myth could move borders faster than any army. While kings fought over castles, cartographers and printers waged a quieter war, one where stories inked onto parchment became fences around territories, and where the most vulnerable figures of all, children, were transformed into unwitting soldiers in a battle of maps and memory. When Gutenberg's press began churning out maps in the late 15th century, it didn't just change how pilgrims navigated, it rewrote the rules of territorial influence. Suddenly, a single design could flood Europe, erasing centuries of local quirks with the brute force of standardization. Take Erhard Etzlaub's Romweg map of 1500, a masterpiece of precision that reduced the winding paths to Rome into crisp, uniform lines. Gone were the monastic scribes' personal annotations about which abbot served the best ale, or where a certain duke's toll collectors could be bribed. In their place stood an impersonal grid of distances, as if the continent had been ironed flat. For the first time, a pilgrim from Flanders and another from Bavaria might hold identical maps, their journeys funneled into the same predetermined corridors. The consequences were revolutionary. Hand-copied maps had always been living documents, tweaked to reflect local alliances or a monastery's latest land acquisition. A Cistercian monk might exaggerate his abbey's prominence on the route, while a Burgundian scribe could discreetly omit a rival lord's castle. But printed maps like Etzlaub's brooked no such nuance. Their crisp woodcuts presented geography as objective fact, subtly privileging certain powers. Notice how the Romweg's paths converge on Nuremberg, Etzlaub's hometown, while alternate routes through French-speaking Lorraine appear faint, almost as afterthoughts. This wasn't cartography, it was cultural hegemony in ink. As these standardized maps spread, they reshaped identities alongside routes. Pilgrims who once identified with their local shrines, the cult of Saint Foy in Conques or Saint Martin in Tours, now found themselves part of a homogenized stream marching toward Rome or Santiago. Regional dialects faded in roadside hostels where everyone consulted the same guidebooks. Even the rhythms of travel changed. Printed itineraries listed fixed stages, turning what had been meandering spiritual journeys into something closer to modern package tours. The Via Francigena was no longer a collection of local trails. It became the way to Rome, its very name cementing the idea of a singular, authoritative path. Behind this shift lurked a quieter transformation, the birth of proto-national borders. When Etzlaub's maps labeled territories as the King of France's lands or the Empire's dominions, they didn't just describe political reality, they reinforced it. A pilgrim holding that map would instinctively see fragmented regions like Burgundy or Provence as mere way stations within larger realms. Print runs made these classifications inescapable, where hand-copied maps might adjust labels depending on which duke commissioned them. Mass-produced versions froze one perspective in time. The Romweg's crisp borders didn't reflect messy medieval realities so much as they anticipated the neat nation-states of the future. Yet for all their efficiency, something vital was lost. Those old monastic maps had been repositories of lived experience, scribbled with warnings about landslide-prone passes or notes about which villages celebrated feast days with free bread for travelers. Printed maps traded this intimacy for scale, sacrificing local knowledge at the altar of uniformity. A 12th century pilgrim might have known which shepherd near La Paille-en-Velay would trade cheese for a prayer. His 16th century counterpart followed arrows on a page, his journey streamlined but stripped of its human texture. The irony, these objective maps were often anything but. Etzlaub's Romweg quietly favored German-speaking hospices, while French printers produced rival versions that inflated the importance of Lyon and Reims. Pilgrims thought they held neutral tools, unaware they were carrying propaganda, the medieval equivalent of algorithmically biased search results. By the time Martin Luther nailed his theses to Wittenberg's door, the groundwork had been laid, a Europe where ideas like borders could spread faster than anyone imagined, all thanks to the humble Pilgrim map's transformation from handmade artifact to mass-produced influencer. The Black Death didn't just ravage bodies, it tore through the very maps pilgrims relied on. As plague swept across Europe in 1348, roads that had been sacred for centuries became death traps. Monasteries that once welcomed travelers with open arms now barred their gates, and market towns famed for their hospitality stood eerily silent. In this chaos, mapmakers faced an impossible task: redrawing Europe's spiritual geography overnight. The result was a cartographic revolution born of desperation, where temporary detours hardened into permanent borders, and where the Alps, once a feared barrier, suddenly became the continent's lifeline. Take the Brenner Pass, that jagged corridor through the Tyrolean Alps. Before the plague, it was just one of many challenging routes, often avoided for lower, warmer valleys. But when the Po River basin became a hotspot of infection, pilgrims and merchants alike had no choice but to veer north. Mapmakers scrambled to update their parchments, inking bold new lines through mountain trails that had barely registered before. By 1350, these emergency detours weren't just footnotes, they were main arteries, their prominence etched into maps with the same gravity as Rome or Jerusalem. The Hereford Mappa Mundi's later editions tell the story. Where alpine passes once appeared as mere squiggles, they now gleamed with gold leaf, labeled as Via Salutis, the road to salvation. This wasn't just about avoiding disease. The plague reshaped power dynamics in ways no treaty ever could. Towns along these new routes, like Innsbruck or Bolzano, found themselves suddenly wealthy, their coffers filled with tolls from travelers who'd never have passed through otherwise. Meanwhile, traditional hubs like Pavia or Piacenza withered, their economies gutted not by war, but by the silent verdict of 1,000 pilgrim feet choosing safer paths. Even the church adapted. Bishops along the Alpine route suddenly found their influence swelling, their sees upgraded from backwaters to strategic strongholds. A map from Salzburg's archives shows the shift vividly. Its scribe has crossed out old Diocesan boundaries with such force the quill tore the parchment, redrawing them to match the new flow of foot traffic. The most striking paradox, these borders born of panic proved more enduring than those carved by conquest. When the plague receded, pilgrims didn't revert to the old ways. The Alpine routes, now well marked and stocked with hospices, retained their status. Merchants had built new warehouses in the mountains. Innkeepers had married their daughters to carters specializing in high-altitude transport. The crisis had created facts on the ground, or rather on the map, that no post-war edict could undo. A 15th century Venetian guidebook captures this perfectly. Its description of the Via Claudia Augusta, once a minor Roman remnant, now sprawls across 2 full pages, complete with tips for winter travel that read like a manual for a well-established highway. As Europe staggered toward recovery, the maps told a story of resilience. Pilgrims still walked to Compostela, but they did so through landscapes forever altered by loss and adaptation. The roads less traveled had become the roads that saved a continent, not with grand decrees, but with the quiet, collective wisdom of survival. And in their winding paths, we see the most profound lesson of all. that sometimes the most lasting borders aren't drawn by the powerful, but by the ordinary footsteps of those simply trying to stay alive. High in the alpine snows, where winds howl through the great St. Bernard Pass, a hospice stood that wielded more power than any fortress. Run by Augustinian monks since the 11th century, this shelter didn't just offer warmth to shivering pilgrims, it functioned as a clandestine border checkpoint. Maps issued to travelers bore a curious feature, a 3-mile radius around the hospice marked in crimson ink, labeled Zona Franca. Within this circle, the monks' authority overrode local lords' laws. Merchants passing through could trade without paying tolls. Fugitives, provided they were pilgrims, enjoyed sanctuary from pursuing knights. This wasn't just hospitality, it was sovereignty carved out with soup ladles and wool blankets. The Order of Malta took this concept further, transforming their pilgrim hostels into a spiderweb of extraterritorial corridors. Their maps, drawn on vellum treated with beeswax to survive sea voyages, depicted a network stretching from Rhodes to Sicily. Each hospice flew the Order's 8-pointed cross flag, signaling that the land beneath it answered to Malta's Grandmaster, not the local king. A pilgrim robbed near a Maltese hostel could demand justice under the Order's maritime laws, even if the crime occurred 50 miles inland. These zones became so entrenched that when Napoleon's armies invaded Italy in 1796, they honored Maltese hostels' neutrality, a testament to borders drawn not by conquest, but by centuries of unchallenged custom. What's startling is how these arrangements prefigured modern diplomatic immunity. The passport issued to pilgrims at Cluny Abbey functioned like a medieval laissez-passer, guaranteeing safe conduct through territories that might otherwise be hostile. Maps produced by the Knights Hospitaller even color-coded regions, white for zones under their protection, red for areas where travelers needed armed escorts. Sound familiar? It's the same logic behind today's green zones in conflict areas or the inviolability of embassies. The real power lay in the details. Maltese hostels didn't just mark safe spaces, they created alternate realities where time itself bent to pilgrim rhythms. Sundials in their courtyards showed hospice hours, distinct from local timekeeping, so travelers wouldn't miss meals. Boundary stones bore inscriptions in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, ensuring merchants from Venice to Damascus understood, cross this line and you're playing by different rules. When the Duke of Savoy tried imposing taxes on the Great St. Bernard Pass in 1453, the monks simply expanded their crimson zone on new maps until his tax collectors stood outside the boundary. By the time the Duke protested, generations of pilgrims had already accepted the revised borders as gospel truth. These fluid frontiers reveal a medieval world far more sophisticated than we assume. The Maltese network wasn't just about shelter. It was a parallel legal universe where faith trumped feudalism. Modern diplomats negotiating extraterritorial agreements might be surprised to learn their walking paths first paved by penniless pilgrims and the monks who mapped their extraordinary privileges. Geoffrey Chaucer's cheerful band of pilgrims might never have reached Canterbury, at least not all of them. Hidden among his fictional travelers were masters of deception, their rosary beads counting not prayers but strategic waypoints. This wasn't just literary flair, it reflected a dark reality. Medieval Europe's pilgrimage routes teemed with spies cloaked in piety, their forged credentials granting access to castles and councils no ordinary envoy could penetrate. Take the infamous case of Brother Gerard, a supposed Franciscan arrested in Burgundy in 1456. His satchel contained a beautifully illuminated psalter, until officials peeled back a layer of paint to reveal a portolan chart beneath, its coastlines marked not with holy sites but naval fortifications and the coded strengths of garrisons. What made these pilgrim spies so effective was the sacred trust they exploited. A lone traveler bearing a scallop shell or a palm frond could cross war-torn territories unscathed, his satchel stuffed with intelligence. The portolan charts they carried were masterpieces of dual-purpose design. To the casual observer, they showed familiar pilgrimage stops along the Mediterranean. But tilt the parchment toward candlelight, and hidden ink would glow. A Venetian fleet's position here, a Moorish prince's troop movements there. Some even incorporated needle-thin pinpricks that, when held to light, projected secret symbols onto walls like a medieval slide projector. The Burgundian scandal of 1456 laid the operation bare. Duke Philip the Good's agents intercepted a group of penitents returning from Santiago de Compostela. Their maps at first glance traced the standard route through Roncesvalles, but a sharp-eyed clerk noticed peculiar flourishes, tiny crosses clustered near border forts, their numbers matching the exact count of stationed knights. Further inspection revealed the pilgrims themselves were mercenaries from Savoy, their forged papers so flawless even abbots had vouched for them. The subsequent trial exposed a network stretching from Lisbon to Constantinople, with pilgrims acting as couriers for everything from siege plans to royal blackmail. Rulers quickly recognized the potential. England's Henry V employed pilgrims to scout French defenses before Agincourt, their staffs hollowed out to hold rolled maps of river crossings. The Knights Hospitaller ran a famed hospice in Rhodes that doubled as an intelligence hub, its guest logs carefully noting which travelers asked suspicious questions about fortifications. Even the Vatican played the game. Papal legates carried pilgrimage maps with watermarks that, when dipped in wine, revealed safe houses for informants. The brilliance of this system lay in its deniability. A spy caught with battle plans could claim they were merely noting hostile locations, a map's odd symbols. Devout shorthand for miraculous springs. When the Duke of Milan accused Florence of espionage in 1482, Florentine diplomats simply produced identical pilgrim guides from their archives, proving the markings were standard devotional aids. By weaponizing the presumption of piety, medieval powers created an intelligence network more resilient than any courier system, one where every wandering friar might be a spy, and every saint's shrine a drop point for secrets. This shadow war reshaped Europe's geography in unexpected ways. When too many pilgrims began disappearing near certain mountain passes, cartographers quietly rerouted major trails, their new paths conveniently skirting military hotspots. The Via Francigena sudden detour around Genoa in the 1440s wasn't due to bandits, as guidebooks claimed. It was because too many fake pilgrims had been caught sketching the city's seawalls. Even today, some of Europe's most scenic hiking trails owe their existence not to landscape, but to medieval espionage protocols. The trust placed in pilgrims had been absolute until it became the perfect camouflage for those who knew how to exploit it. Edward III's ban on English pilgrims traveling to France in 1337 wasn't just about keeping souls at home, it was a stroke of geopolitical genius. By forbidding his subjects from crossing the Channel to visit shrines like Mont Saint, Mitchell, or Rocamadour, he wasn't merely protecting them from wartime dangers. He was severing an invisible web of connections that had long bound England to French soil. Every pilgrim who once walked the roads of Normandy or Aquitaine wasn't just a traveler, they were a living thread stitching the Plantagenet domains together. Cut those threads and suddenly the mental map of English territory shrank back to the island itself. Venice played the opposite game with dazzling cunning. While Edward barred movement, the Serenissima actively flooded the eastern Mediterranean with pilgrims, especially after 1453, when the Ottomans seized Constantinople. Venetian galley captains distributed free maps to Holy Land travelers, their routes carefully plotted to showcase Christian strongholds like Crete and Cyprus. On the surface, these were pious gestures, but look closer and the subtext screamed, "These waters are still ours." A pilgrim praying in Rhodes might not realize they were standing in a Knights Hospitaller fortress funded by Venetian gold, but the message to the sublime port was clear. Every ship full of devout travelers to Jerusalem was a floating rebuttal to Ottoman claims over the Levant. These maneuvers reveal a medieval truth: controlling pilgrimage was proxy warfare. When the King of Aragon blocked Castilian pilgrims from Compostela routes in 1429, he wasn't just being petty, he was choking off a flow of cultural influence that had legitimized Castile's dominance for centuries. Similarly, Burgundy's sudden enthusiasm for promoting local saints like Saint Claude in the 1440s wasn't purely spiritual. It redirected lucrative pilgrim traffic away from French-controlled Vézelay, starving rival towns of income while bolstering Burgundian identity. The Reformation turned this quiet weapon into a sledgehammer. Protestant reformers didn't just reject relics and shrines, they systematically erased them from maps. A stunning 1542 edition of Sebastian Münster's Cosmographia shows the erasure in action. Routes to Rome still appear, but now labeled with warnings about papist superstitions. Pilgrimage sites in England vanished entirely, their spaces repurposed on new Protestant maps as historical curiosities or, more tellingly, strategic military points. When Henry VIII's agents destroyed Becket's shrine at Canterbury, they didn't stop at the physical structure. They scrubbed it from every itinerary, ensuring future generations would navigate a mental landscape where Canterbury was just another town, not a spiritual compass point. What began as kings tweaking travel permits ended as a wholesale remapping of European consciousness. The roads remained, but their meanings had been rewritten, not with swords, but with the quiet power of absence. A pilgrim banned here, a shrine crossed off there, until one day, people woke up to find their world smaller, their horizons abruptly redrawn by the very maps they once trusted to guide them. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to Wittenberg's church door, he didn't just challenge papal authority. He declared war on Europe's sacred geography. Within months of the Reformation's spark, a bonfire of maps lit up Saxony's town squares. Pilgrimage charts that had guided generations to Rome, Aachen, and Compostela fed the flames, their curling edges blackening into ash. But this was no mindless destruction, it was surgical erasure. Luther's collaborator Lucas Cranach the Elder, better known for his portraits, took up a different brush. His workshop began producing stark new maps where Catholic shrines either vanished entirely or appeared with damning labels. Idolatry here, next to Cologne's Cathedral, Purgatory's Lie, scrawled across depictions of St. Peter's. The audacity of these revisions can't be overstated. For centuries, the Church had controlled spiritual cartography, placing Rome at the center of every pilgrim's mental universe. Now, Protestant presses churned out maps that literally dissented Catholicism. Cranach's 1525 True Christian Pilgrimage map replaced physical journeys with an inward spiral. No roads leading to distant shrines, just concentric circles labeled faith, scripture, and grace converging on Wittenberg itself. Overnight, the devout were handed a new compass. The path to salvation no longer ran through foreign lands, but through the pages of a German Bible. Catholic cartographers fought back with equal fervor. Jesuit mapmakers like Antonio Posavino crafted intricate rebuttals where Protestant cities appeared as smoldering ruins on the road to hell, while Compostela gleamed brighter than ever. The most ingenious counterstroke came from Rome's Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, which began embedding tiny crosses in the borders of approved maps hold one to candlelight, and the watermark revealed hidden trails to still safe shrines. In the Alps, Benedictine monks carved three-dimensional pilgrimage maps into wooden altarpieces, their routes impossible to burn without destroying the sacred art itself. These dueling geographies hardened into something unprecedented, borders not of territory but of belief. Decades before the Peace of Westphalia formally recognized confessional boundaries in 1648, travelers knew exactly when they'd crossed from Lutheran lands to Catholic by the maps they could or couldn't buy. A merchant leaving Nuremberg might purchase a Cranach-style chart showing Prague's churches as hollow shells, only to have it confiscated at the Bohemian border, where hawkers sold Catholic versions labeling Wittenberg as heretic's den. The greatest casualty was the medieval pilgrims' trust in the map itself. What good was a guide that might be outlawed by the next town's gate? Some travelers resorted to carrying dual sets, a Protestant map for display, a Catholic one hidden in a boot heel. Others memorized coded annotations, like the Bavarian weavers who taught their children that good wool markets on certain maps meant Mass could be heard safely there. By the time the 30 Years' War erupted in 1618, Europe's spiritual landscape had already been fractured not by soldiers, but by the pens of reformers and the presses that turned their visions into the new reality. The maps that once unified Christendom now documented its irreparable divide. A pilgrim's badge was never just a trinket, it was a tiny, wearable map of power. Take those scallop shells sold by the thousand in Santiago de Compostela, each one etched with delicate lines mimicking the roads to the shrine. To the untrained eye, they were simple mementos. But look closer. The shells distributed by French-controlled hostels exaggerated routes through Aquitaine, while those from Leon-backed workshops highlighted paths through Castilian territory. Press one into warm wax, and suddenly your kitchen table bore an imprint of somebody's political agenda, disguised as devotion. The Canterbury badges of the 1380s perfected this craft. Cast in lead and no larger than a coin, they depicted St. Thomas Becket's murder, but with a cunning twist. The background showed not just Canterbury Cathedral, but the entire Kentish coast with Calais prominently marked. This was no accident. England had seized Calais decades earlier, and these badges, sold to pilgrims by the thousands, reinforced the idea that the town wasn't some foreign outpost, but a natural extension of English soil. A farmer pinning one to his hat might think he was honoring a saint, but he was also absorbing a cartographic argument that would later justify Henry V's invasion of France. Even the material spoke volumes. Unlike fragile parchment, these metal badges survived rain, sweat, and time. They circulated far beyond the elite, reaching markets and fields where few could read but everyone understood symbols. A badge from Rocamatta might show the Virgin Mary cradling a tiny map of the Dordogne Valley, subtly reminding travelers that this was sacred ground, and by extension worth defending from encroaching lords. The Vatican caught on quickly, commissioning badges for Jubilee years that depicted Rome not just as a city, but as the radiant center of a spiderweb of roads, all leading back to the Pope. The parallels to modern souvenir diplomacy are uncanny. Today's embassy gift shops still stock miniature monuments or postcards framing contested borders as settled fact. Think of Armenia's apricot-shaped chocolates sold with maps showing Nagorno-Karabakh, or Greece's Parthenon keychains that quietly ignore Ottoman history. Just like medieval pilgrims, tourists become unwitting ambassadors, carrying these narratives in their pockets. What's striking is how little the strategy has changed. A 1395 badge from Aachen shows Charlemagne's empire stretching from Paris to Prague. a fantasy geography that Habsburg rulers later revived to justify their own expansion. 6 centuries later, China's 9-dash line appears on everything from passport covers to action figures, turning South China sea claims into something as mundane as a child's toy. The medium evolves, but the message remains: control the souvenirs and you shape how the world remembers and ultimately believes. These artifacts prove borders aren't just drawn on parchment or enforced by armies. They're etched in lead, sewn onto cloaks, and carried home in the palms of ordinary people who never realize they're holding a map or the blueprint for a future war. When Viking longships darkened the horizons of 9th century Ireland, Gaelic monks didn't just hide their treasures, they rewrote the maps. Columbanus and his followers, those restless scribes of the Celtic Church, crafted guides so ingeniously coded they'd baffle even the most determined Norse raider. Take the Carthage manuscripts, those luminous psalters said to have been written by Saint Columba himself. Beneath their gilded Latin verses lay something far more practical. Faint charcoal lines tracing hidden paths between monastic cells, their waypoints disguised as illuminated letters. A capital M might mark a mountain pass. The curve of a D could indicate a freshwater spring safe from Viking patrols. To the uninitiated, these were sacred texts. To the monks, they were lifelines, portable blueprints of a vanishing world. The brilliance of these maps lay in their dual purpose. While Viking warlords burned monasteries above ground, the monks preserved their connections underground, literally. Recent archaeology confirms what the Carthage hints at: tunnels linking sites like Clonmacnoise to hidden coastal caves, their entrances disguised as shrines. A pilgrim seeking refuge wouldn't find them by asking directions, but by studying the spacing of certain psalms' verse intervals corresponding to paces between safe houses. This wasn't just navigation, it was sacred cryptography, turning scripture into a survival manual. Even more remarkable was how these networks transcended later invasions. When Normans stormed Ireland's eastern shores in the 12th century, they assumed control of the major roads, but the old Gaelic routes, those whispered paths in the Carthage, remained untouched, allowing Irish scholars to maintain ties with Scottish counterparts. A monk fleeing Wexford could still reach Iona by following clues embedded in hymn lyrics. The path of the just is as a shining light, might lead to a hidden cove where a Scottish fishing boat waited on the 3rd moon of Lent. These weren't just escape routes, they were the veins of a resilient Celtic Christendom, pumping faith and learning beneath the conqueror's feet. Then came the maritime turn. As overland travel grew perilous, the monks adapted their cartography to the sea. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani, that fantastical tale of St. Brendan's Atlantic voyage, hides startlingly accurate coastal maps beneath its Whale Island legends. Scholars now recognize its descriptions of crystal pillars as icebergs off Greenland, while islands of Smiths match volcanic Iceland. These weren't mere stories, they were pilgrim guides disguised as allegory, teaching seafarers to navigate by whale migrations and seabird flight patterns. A 9th century Irish currach following Brendan's map could theoretically reach Newfoundland centuries before the Vikings. What began as desperate scribbles in the margins of psalters evolved into Europe's first maritime pilgrimage network. The monk's secret survived in plain sight, its true purpose veiled by piety until now. Those faint lines on vellum, they weren't just saving souls, they were redrawing the map of the medieval world, one coded psalm at a time. The sea routes to Compostela weren't just pathways for the faithful. They were the medieval equivalent of shipping lanes, bristling with hidden political stakes. While most pilgrims trudged overland, wealthier travelers and their precious cargo often took to the water, sparking a quiet revolution in maritime borders. The English pilgrim galleys that set sail from Southampton and Bristol didn't just carry rosaries and repentance. They transported wool, tin, and strategic intelligence, their decks humming with deals struck under the guise of devotion. These ships followed carefully guarded sea charts, some marked with cryptic symbols indicating which stretches of coast were friendly to English merchants, a euphemism for waters where local lords turned a blind eye to smuggling under pilgrim cover. Venice and Genoa took this game to another level. The famed 1295 Pilgrim sea map, discovered in a Dubrovnik monastery, reveals a startling detail. The Adriatic isn't just charted, it's partitioned. Swaths of blue bear tiny crests, the winged lion of Venice here, the cross of Genoa there. These weren't arbitrary decorations, they were claims. A pilgrim boarding a ship in Venice would follow routes studded with Venetian symbols, subtly reinforcing the idea that these waters belonged to the Serenissima. Genoa's copies of the same map, predictably, showed their own emblems dominating the Ligurian Sea. What looked like navigational aids were, in truth, the first draft of maritime sovereignty, a silent battle over who controlled the liquid highways of medieval Europe. The genius of this system lay in its fluid enforcement. Unlike land borders where a castle or wall marked dominion, sea claims relied on perception. If enough pilgrims, captains, and merchants treated a stretch of water as Venetian territory, it effectively became so. Naval patrols might back the claim, but the real power resided in the maps themselves. A 1298 Genoese decree even mandated that all pilgrim ships bound for Compostela carry notarized charts not for safety, but to ensure their preferred maritime borders were disseminated far and wide. These early territorial waters weren't just about control, they birthed new legal concepts. When a Castilian ship sank off Brittany in 1302, the subsequent salvage dispute hinged on an unexpected question. Was the wreck in Pilgrim waters under Leon's protection, or the neutral zone claimed by Breton fishermen? The court ultimately ruled based on a Compostela pilgrimage map's markings, setting a precedent that would echo centuries later in Hugo Grotius' Mare Liberum. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these sea routes was their accidental diplomacy. Pilgrim ships became floating neutral zones where rivals could mingle without declaring truces. A 1324 peace negotiation between Naples and Aragon famously took place aboard a Compostela-bound galley, its decks deemed sacred ground. The ship's own map, still preserved in Barcelona's archives, bears annotations in 4 languages, a testament to how pilgrimage routes wove together not just coasts but cultures. By the time Columbus set sail, the idea that waters could be owned was already ingrained, thanks not to explorers or conquerors, but to pilgrims whose journeys had quietly mapped the rules of a new world. The scallop shells they carried home were more than souvenirs. They were tiny, tangible proof that the sea, once a boundless wilderness, could be divided one sacred voyage at a time. In medieval Europe, the distance between 2 points wasn't measured in miles or leagues. It was counted in pilgrim days. A journey from Paris to Vézelay might be 12 days on a French map, while the same route could stretch to 15 on a German chart. This wasn't inconsistency, it was a cultural cartography where borders weren't fixed lines but fluid zones shaped by how fast or how comfortably people moved. A pilgrim's day wasn't just a unit of distance, it was a window into regional rhythms, trade networks, and even political influence. Take the stark contrast between German and Italian maps. North of the Alps, where broad valleys and well-maintained Roman roads still crisscrossed the landscape, a pilgrim's day might cover 15 miles. But in Italy's rugged Apennines, where bandits lurked and mountain passes slowed progress, 10 miles was the norm. These weren't arbitrary choices, They reflected deeper truths. German abbey hostels were spaced farther apart, trusting in safer roads, while Italian routes clustered stops closer, accounting for terrain and risk. Over time, these calculations hardened into mental borders. To a Bavarian monk, Lombardy wasn't just another region, it was a place where distances shrank, making foreign lands feel deceptively near. This temporal mapping reshaped power dynamics in unexpected ways. When the Holy Roman Emperor claimed sovereignty over northern Italy, his German advisors groaned at the endless travel time, not because the peninsula was vast, but because their own maps had trained them to expect 15-mile days. Meanwhile, Italian merchants exploited the reverse perception. By advertising the Brenner Pass as only 20 days to Augsburg using their shorter mile standard, they lured more pilgrims and their coin southward. It was border control by psychology, where rulers didn't need walls when they could manipulate the very sense of space. The most fascinating twist, pilgrim days became a medieval speed limit. Maps produced by the Cistercians, famed for their strict travel rules, often added extra days to routes passing through towns with lively taverns or markets. A one-day trek might stretch to 2, subtly steering travelers toward monastic hostels instead of secular inns. Conversely, routes through church-controlled lands magically shortened, reinforcing the idea that spiritual journeys moved faster under divine favor. These temporal borders left echoes we still feel today. Modern hiking guides to the Camino de Santiago often cite medieval travel times alongside modern ones, not out of nostalgia, but because those ancient rhythms still shape where villages thrive. A town that was a day's walk from Cluny in the 12th century likely still has its pilgrim hostel, now a boutique hotel. The land didn't change, but the maps and the meaning of a day's journey rewrote the landscape forever. Abraham Cresque's workshop in Mallorca was a cartographic crossroads where faiths converged without fanfare. The Jewish mapmaker, serving Christian King Peter IV of Aragon, crafted the legendary Catalan Atlas of 1375, a masterpiece where Mecca's golden dome shimmered beside Compostela's scallop shells. His secret, a network of informants spanning Granada's mosques, Marseille's synagogues, and Rome's pilgrim hostels, each contributing fragments of sacred geography. Cresques didn't just draw borders, he dissolved them, depicting Christian, Jewish, and Muslim holy sites with equal reverence. Pilgrims clutching his maps could trace routes from Canterbury to Cairo without realizing they held a radical vision, one where devotion transcended dogma. The Pilgrim's Guide to Jerusalem reveals even subtler collaboration. Surviving copies in the Vatican Library show Arabic marginalia, not corrections but enhancements. Next to Latin descriptions of the Holy Sepulchre, neat gnashed script points pilgrims toward Muslim-run bathhouses for sore feet or notes which gates closed at sunset under Ayyubid rule. These weren't intrusions, they were lifelines. Christian travelers relying on these annotated guides could navigate Jerusalem's labyrinthine alleys with advice from the very communities Crusaders had once fought. The map's quiet pragmatism created an unspoken pact. Pilgrims got safe passage, while Muslim scribes ensured their city's sacred sites, shared spaces like Solomon's stables, remained respected by all. This interfaith cartography flourished in borderlands where politics demanded flexibility. Along the Camino de Santiago's southern forks, Mozarabic scribes, Christians living under Muslim rule, produced hybrid maps for multi-religious travelers. Their versions marked not just cathedrals but mezquitas with Christian altars, like Cordoba's Great Mosque, where pilgrims could hear Mass beneath Islamic arches. Jewish mapmakers in Toledo took it further, encoding trail marks with Hebrew letters visible only to trained eyes, a discreet safety net for coreligionists fleeing pogroms under the guise of pilgrimage. The real marvel was how these maps normalized coexistence. Cresques' atlas depicted the Nile flowing past Coptic monasteries and Mamluk palaces without hierarchy. A pilgrim planning their route absorbed an unconscious lesson. Sacred spaces weren't monopolized by any one faith. When the Armenian Bishop Gregory of Tatov commissioned a map of Levantine shrines in 1420, he included Muslim shrines like Nabi Musa not as rivals, but as waypoints on a shared spiritual landscape. These cartographers' legacy lies in the routes that outlasted wars. The Via Francigena's alternate path through Lucera, a Muslim-majority town in Italy, remained open even during the Albigensian Crusade because local maps labeled it a zone of sanctuary. Pilgrim badges found in Andalusia blend the cross of Lorraine with the hand of Fatima, tangible proof that for ordinary travelers, the boundaries between faiths were never as rigid as the powers claimed. While kings drew lines in blood, these mapmakers traced connections in ink, leaving trails that still whisper, "The road to the divine need not be walked alone." The champagne fairs of Troyes didn't just sell silk and spices, they hacked the medieval economy using pilgrimage routes as their blueprint. Picture this, 4 times a year, a patch of French farmland transformed into a bustling metropolis where Lombard bankers rubbed shoulders with Flemish wool merchants, all under the sacred umbrella of St. John's Fair. The genius wasn't just the timing coinciding with peak pilgrim traffic to Vézelay, but the maps. Official charters depicted the fairgrounds as a blank white circle, labeled locus neutralis, a legal no-man's land where feudal taxes dissolved like morning mist. A pilgrim carrying silver to Compostela could exchange it for letters of credit here without paying a single denier to local lords, all because the route's spiritual status created a loophole in earthly authority. These fairs weren't just opportunistic, they were cartographically engineered. The Mappa Mercatorum of 1284, preserved in Troyes archives, reveals the sleight of hand. Pilgrimage roads leading to the fairgrounds are drawn in thick vermilion, as if they were extensions of the Via Francigena itself. Never mind that the actual route bypassed the site by miles, the visual suggestion was enough to confer sacred immunity. Even the fair's layout mimicked a pilgrim's circuit, with Italian silk dealers clustered near the Jerusalem Quarter and German metalworkers near the Santiago Alley. Merchants weren't just trading goods, they were performing a kind of commercial liturgy, their transactions sanctified by proximity to imagined sacred geography. The Champagne counts took this further, commissioning badges that blended piety and profit. A pewter pilgrim's scallop shell might conceal tiny notches along its edge, a code indicating which moneylenders offered fair exchange rates. Maps distributed to Genoese traders went further, marking safe houses with symbols borrowed from the Liber Sancti Jacobi. A cross here meant honest brokers, while a shell with a crack warned of counterfeiters. The system worked because it exploited a universal truth. No one, not even the greediest toll collector, dared interfere with a pilgrim's spiritual journey, even if that journey now included buying Venetian glassware tax-free. This medieval innovation echoes in places like Dubai's Jebel Ali today. The modern free trade zone, with its duty-free shops and extraterritorial courts, operates on the same principle as Troyes' locus neutralis. Carve out a space where normal rules don't apply and let commerce flow. Even the signage feels familiar where medieval maps used crosses and shells. Jebel Ali's logos feature palm trees and sailing dhows, symbols that subtly imply both tradition and neutrality. The real legacy of the Champagne fairs isn't just in their ledgers, but in how they proved that the most powerful borders aren't always marked on the ground. Sometimes they're drawn in the collective imagination, reinforced by the footsteps of pilgrims and the ink of maps that dared to redefine what space could mean. Step inside Chartres Cathedral, and you're not just standing in a sacred space, you're walking a meticulously crafted replica of the medieval world. The floor beneath your feet isn't just stone, it's a scaled-down pilgrimage route, with every chapel, column, and crypt arranged to mirror the spiritual geography of Europe. At St. Denis, the very birthplace of Gothic architecture, the ambulatory unfolds like a miniature via Francigena. Each radiant chapel represents a key stop on the road to Rome. Vézel's fervor here, Cluny's grandeur there, all compressed into a single, awe-inspiring circuit. Pilgrims who couldn't trek across the Alps could still journey to holy sites simply by pacing the cathedral's labyrinth, their fingertips tracing the same symbolic path in cold marble that others walked in dust and mud. The genius of this design wasn't just symbolic, it was psychological. Ribbed vaults arched overhead like mountain passes, while stained glass saints cast colored light that shifted with the sun, echoing the way real landscapes transformed under pilgrims' weary feet. At Amiens Cathedral, the labyrinth's 11 concentric circles precisely matched the 11-day walking distance from the city to Compostela. Worshippers completing the maze on their knees weren't just performing penance, they were reenacting the physical struggle of the Camino, their blistered hands and aching joints mirroring the hardships of the road. Even the cathedral's height played its part. Soaring naves mimicked the vertigo pilgrims felt crossing the Pyrenees, while sudden bursts of light through clerestory windows recreated the euphoria of reaching a mountain summit. Architects weaponized these parallels to reinforce political narratives. When Reims Cathedral rebuilt after a fire in 1210, its new floor plan subtly emphasized chapels dedicated to saints venerated in French-controlled territories. A pilgrim circling the ambulatory would unknowingly absorb a lesson. These lands weren't just part of the kingdom, they were woven into the sacred order itself. Meanwhile, Canterbury Cathedral's eastern extension after Becket's martyrdom carefully replicated the distances between key English-held towns in Normandy, binding cross-channel territories into a single devotional map. The message was clear: faith and sovereignty shared the same blueprint. The most cunning twist lay in the relics. Just as pilgrimage routes connected far-flung shrines, cathedral architects arranged sacred bones to mirror those geographic relationships. St. Denis clustered martyrs from the Rhine Valley near its northern apse, while Provençal saints occupied the southern transept, aligning their earthly origins with their architectural positions. Pilgrims moving clockwise around the choir weren't just honoring saints, they were retracing the footsteps of their own ancestors' journeys, reinforcing regional loyalties with every genuflection. Even the cathedral's very walls functioned as memory palaces. Niches holding statues of biblical kings corresponded to stops on the Jerusalem route, turning theology into an immersive cartographic experience. This architectural sleight of hand reached its peak with the rose windows. Chartres' North Rose doesn't just depict the Virgin, it's a celestial compass, with 12 petals pointing to key Marian shrines across Europe. Light streaming through turns the nave floor into a sundial, each beam illuminating different chapel altars at times corresponding to their real-world counterparts' canonical hours. A worshipper watching noon light hit the Rome chapel wasn't just seeing sunlight, they were witnessing a cosmic affirmation that this stone simulacrum truly mirrored the divine order. By the 15th century, these stone maps had done their work so well that the buildings themselves became pilgrimage destinations. People no longer needed to walk to Santiago when they could trace its path in the cool shadows of Bourges Cathedral. The borders these architects drew weren't marked on parchment or enforced by armies, they were carved in limestone and lit by stained glass, shaping perception so deeply that even today, we still speak of navigating cathedrals, unaware we're echoing the footsteps of medieval pilgrims who once used these vaulted halls as their atlas. In the quiet scriptorium of Hohenberg Abbey, where the winter light slanted through narrow windows, Sister Guda dipped her quill into ink made from crushed lapis lazuli. The Hortus Deliciarum, her 12th century masterpiece, wasn't just an encyclopedia of theology, it was a secret atlas. Amidst its vibrant illuminations of saints and sinners lay something radical, a map of the Rhine Valley where towns weren't marked by walls or castles, but by the convents that anchored them. Strasbourg didn't appear as a bishop's stronghold, but as a cluster of women's scriptoria. The Black Forest wasn't a wilderness, but a tapestry of herbal gardens tended by Benedictine nuns. This was geography rewritten by the hands that history nearly erased. Guda's work reveals a startling truth. Medieval convents weren't just preservers of maps, they were laboratories of alternative cartography. While monks charted pilgrimage routes for kings, nuns like Guda mapped the world as women experienced it. The Hortus's routes bypassed traditional male way stations, highlighting female-run hospices, midwife networks, and even clandestine paths for abused wives fleeing to sanctuary. A river might be noted not for its fords, but for the shallow bends where laundresses gathered intelligence no knight's map would deem valuable. These details weren't oversights, they were deliberate acts of resistance. When Guda sketched the roads between convents thicker than those linking cathedrals, she wasn't just drawing lines, she was redrawing power. The contrast with mainstream pilgrimage guides couldn't be starker. Compare Guda's work to the Codex Callixtinus, that 12th century handbook for Compostela pilgrims. Where the Codex glorified battle sites like Roncesvalles, Guda's maps marked the graves of women healers along the same route. While male cartographers obsessed over jurisdictional borders, convent maps tracked something subtler: zones of female influence. The Psalter map of Ebstorf, likely crafted by Saxon canonesses, depicted Jerusalem not as a crusader prize, but as a web of connections to European convents, each thread a lineage of abbesses, letter exchanges, and relic transfers. These weren't just maps, they were manifestos, asserting that spiritual authority flowed through matrilineal networks as surely as rivers carved valleys. Some of these female cartographers wielded their craft with breathtaking cunning. The Guta Sintram Codex from 12th century Alsace contains a seemingly innocuous depiction of the zodiac, until you notice the constellations are plotted to align with key women's monasteries across Europe. Virgo's stars map onto the Abbey of Remiremont. Cassiopeia's chair points to Quedlinburg. It was celestial navigation for the initiated. A sister could trace her way across Christendom by the stars, guided by a cosmic trail only her order could read. Other convent maps used liturgical calendars as cipher keys. The feast day of Saint Scholastica might correspond to a hidden mountain pass, while Saint Agnes's vigil marked a safe river crossing. What we're uncovering now, after centuries of neglect, is how these alternative geographies shaped real-world politics. When the Count of Flanders tried seizing lands near Bruges in 1235, the nuns of Ter-Dost produced a century-old map showing the area as a woven grid of women's vegetable plots, not empty wasteland as the Count claimed. In Spain, the Beatus of Liébana manuscripts, often copied by Mozarabic nuns, preserved pre-Reconquista routes through Muslim-held territories that male chroniclers had erased. These maps didn't just record space, they defended it, stitch by careful stitch. The tragedy is how thoroughly this tradition was suppressed. Of the 38 major convents known to have produced maps before 1400, only 7 originals survive, often because they were misattributed to monks. A map fragment from Los Huelgas Abbey was catalogued as anonymous, until ultraviolet light revealed the signature of Abbess Arroca Dyers beneath layers of varnish. Another, from the Italian convent of Santa Giulia, was nearly discarded as a cookbook until scholars noticed its marginalia contained precise distances between vineyards and birthing houses. Yet traces linger in unexpected places. Next time you see a medieval T&O map with Jerusalem at the center, look closer. The ones made by women often place Eden, not the Temple Mount, as the heart of the world, surrounded by 4 rivers representing the cardinal virtues rather than continents. It's a quiet subversion, not a geography of conquest, but of return to beginnings. In the folds of these parchment rebellions, we find a lost compass, one that didn't point toward power, but toward the places where women quietly redrew the world. The ink-stained maps of medieval pilgrims did more than guide footsteps, they quietly stitched together a continent. Long before diplomats drew lines on parchment, these handmade charts wove Europe into a tapestry of shared paths, where a merchant from Bruges and a monk from Cluny could navigate the same roads with the same trust. Borders shifted not through conquest, but through the collective memory of countless travelers who carried not swords, but scalloped shells and scraps of vellum. The real miracle wasn't in the relics they sought, but in the invisible threads they spun, threads of commerce, faith, and cultural exchange that turned fragmented kingdoms into something resembling a unified whole. Consider the EU's Modern Cultural Routes program, which retraces these ancient pilgrim trails as heritage corridors. When you walk the Camino de Santiago today, you're stepping into a tradition that softened borders 1,000 years before Schengen. The EU didn't invent this idea, it simply institutionalized what medieval mapmakers already knew, that roads are more than dirt and stone. They're living conduits of connection, where a German backpacker and a Spanish innkeeper can share stories as effortlessly as their ancestors traded wool and wine. The same soft power that once made Compostela a crossroads of Christendom now fuels Erasmus exchanges and cross-border art projects, proving that the old maps still whisper to us. Yet the pilgrims' greatest lesson lies in their challenge to how we imagine borders. We think of them as fixed, immutable lines drawn in blood and ratified by treaties. But medieval Europe knew another truth. Boundaries could bend to the weight of footsteps, to the flow of silver and silk, to the quiet authority of a well-worn path. The Alpine passes that became trade routes, the hostels that turned into de facto embassies, the merchant guilds that enforced their own laws across kingdoms, all were testaments to the fluidity of human movement. So here's an invitation: look beyond the maps we've inherited. Trace your own ancestral pilgrimages, whether your grandparents crossed oceans or simply moved from village to city for work. Find the modern equivalents of those medieval way stations, the cafes where migrants swap job leads, the online forums where ideas leap borders faster than any Viking ship. And if you've witnessed a border shift without a single shot fired, a street where cultures blend, a policy that erased an old divide, share it, because the parchment may be digital now, but the pen, as always, is in our hands. The pilgrims showed us that borders are stories, not walls. What's the next chapter?